The first time the people of Hartwell, Colorado saw Joseph Crawford come down from the mountains twice in a single year, they knew something had changed in the man, and every soul in town quietly suspected it had something to do with the woman who had arrived on the stage in April. Hartwell sat at the edge of the San Juan foothills in the year 1879, a town that had grown from a single trading post into something resembling civilization, though civilization in Colorado territory still carried the sharp scent of gun oil and pine resin and horses that hadn't been properly groomed since autumn. The main street was rutted mud in spring, cracked dust in summer, and frozen iron in winter. There was Elmore's General Store, the Hartwell Saloon, a church that doubled as a schoolroom on weekdays, Doc Pierce's office above the livery stable, and the Ridgeline Inn, which Mabel Hutchins ran with the efficiency of a military general and the warmth of a grandmother. There was a telegraph office that worked when the lines held, and a post office that worked when Gerald Foote felt inclined to sort his mail. It was the kind of town that minded its own business loudly and publicly, where everyone knew your name before you'd had the chance to introduce yourself. Joseph Crawford was not precisely a citizen of Hartwell. He lived 11 miles up the mountain in a log cabin he had built himself, on a shelf of land above the tree line, where the wind came off the peaks in winter like a living thing, trying to push you back down to the valley. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same dark wood as his cabin walls. He had a dark beard that he trimmed once a year whether it needed it or not, eyes the color of storm clouds over the San Juans, and a quietness about him that some people mistook for unfriendliness and others, the more perceptive ones, recognized as a man who had learned early that words cost more than they were often worth. He had come to the mountains after the war. Not the Civil War. Joseph was too young for that, having been born in 1848. He had come after a smaller, personal war, the kind that doesn't get written into history books but leaves its marks on a man just as deep. He had buried his father in Ohio, watched his family's farm go under, and drifted west the way young men did in those years, when the continent itself seemed to be saying there was more room if you were willing to walk far enough to find it. He'd worked cattle drives, learned trapping, spent 2 winters with a Ute trapper named Three Bears who taught him more about the mountains than any book could have managed, and eventually he had climbed up to that shelf of land above Hartwell and decided he was done moving. Every year in early October, Joseph Crawford came down to Hartwell to trade his furs and dried meat for the supplies he needed to last through the mountain winter. Salt, flour, gunpowder, coffee, lamp oil, and whatever small luxuries Elmore's might have that he hadn't managed to make or grow or hunt himself. He would arrive in the morning, conduct his business with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had planned every item on his list months in advance, share a single drink at the saloon with Hank Elmore and whoever else was present, and be back on the mountain trail before the afternoon light shifted. He had done this for 7 years running. The people of Hartwell had come to regard it as reliable as the turning of leaves. Joseph Crawford coming down meant winter was coming. Joseph Crawford going back up meant summer was truly over. Nobody expected him to come down in April of 1879. Nobody, that is, except perhaps the mountain itself, which had its own inscrutable opinions about the season. Rosa Ramsey arrived on the westbound stage on the 14th of April, which happened to be a Tuesday, which happened to be the same day that old Hector Diaz's barn roof finally gave in to the accumulated weight of 4 months of snow and subsequent rain. Hartwell was therefore in the middle of a collective emergency when the stage rolled and half the men in town were over at Hector's place, passing timber and arguing about load-bearing beams, while the women were distributing coffee and bread and organized sympathy. This meant that when the stage door opened and Rosa Ramsey stepped down onto the main street of Hartwell, Colorado for the first time, there was almost no one there to see it. Almost. Mabel Hutchins was there, because Mabel Hutchins was always where she needed to be, apparently by some form of intuition that defied geographical limitation. And Gerald Foote was there, because the stage brought mail. And old Pete Rucker was sitting outside the saloon in his customary chair, because Pete Rucker had not moved voluntarily for anything short of a fire in 15 years. Rosa stepped down from the stage and looked at the street and the mountains beyond it, and she held herself very still for a moment in the way that people do when they are working out whether a place is going to be what they hoped or something else entirely. She was 26 years old, though she looked younger in some lights and older in others, the way people do when they have seen a great deal in a short time. She had dark hair pinned up under a practical hat, brown eyes that caught the light and held it, and a quality of attention about her, the way she looked at things, the main street, the mountains, the rutted mud, that made it clear she was not a woman who missed much. She was wearing a traveling dress that had started out a deep burgundy and had faded to something more complex and interesting, the color of old wine. She carried a single large trunk and a carpet bag, and she carried them herself, which told Pete Rucker everything he needed to know about her character even before she'd said a word. She said a word to Mabel Hutchins, who materialized at her elbow with the inevitability of gravity. "I'm Rosa Ramsey," she said, and her voice was direct and warm, a schoolteacher's voice, as it turned out, because that was precisely what she was. "I was told to speak with whoever runs the town regarding the teaching position." Mabel's face opened like a window in spring. "Oh, my dear, you are an answer to prayer," she said, and took Rosa's arm with the authority of a woman who has decided something, and that was more or less the official beginning of Rosa Ramsey's life in Hartwell, Colorado. She had come from Kansas, before Kansas from Missouri, before Missouri from Virginia, where she had been born and where her parents had died within 6 months of each other when she was 19, within the influenza outbreak of 1872, which had moved through that part of Virginia with all the discriminating kindness of a wildfire. She had taught school in Kansas for 3 years, in a small town called Milford, which had been pleasant enough until the man who ran the school board had decided that Rosa's insistence on teaching the Mexican children, alongside the white children, constituted a form of rebellion he was not prepared to tolerate. She had been offered a choice between adjusting her approach and finding employment elsewhere. Rosa Ramsey had never been a woman who adjusted her approaches when her approaches were right. She had heard about Hartwell through a letter from a woman named Agnes Whitmore, who had been a teaching colleague in Milford and whose cousin lived in Colorado Territory. The letter had described a town in need of a teacher, a school board that was more interested in results than politics, and a landscape that was, in Agnes's cousin's words, so beautiful it hurts your chest when you look at it. Rosa had packed her trunk and her carpet bag and bought a stage ticket, and here she was. Mabel installed her in the best room at the Ridgeline Inn, which had a window that faced the mountains, and over coffee and fresh bread that evening, she told Rosa everything there was to know about Hartwell, which took approximately 2.5 hours and was thorough to the point of being encyclopedic. She told her about the families, the children, the school board, the history of the town, the history of the territory, and a number of items of personal gossip that Rosa suspected she was not strictly required to know, but which she filed away nonetheless because information in a new place was as valuable as food and shelter. Mabel also told her about Joseph Crawford, because Mabel told everyone about Joseph Crawford at some point in the first week of their acquaintance, apparently as a point of local pride. "Lives up on the mountain," Mabel said, refilling Rosa's coffee with the possessiveness of a woman who had strong opinions about hospitality. 11 miles up, built his own cabin. Traps, hunts, trades, comes down every October regular as clockwork, has done for 7 years. Man's entirely self-sufficient, which I find admirable and a little melancholy if I'm being honest with myself. She paused. He is 31 and he is not unattractive, and if you were the type of woman who was interested in a project, he might be worth considering. But he is not easy, and the mountain life is not for everyone." She said this last part with the measured tone of someone who had perhaps suggested this possibility to one or two previous visitors, with outcomes that had not been precisely triumphant. Rosa, who was tired and had been on stages for the better part of a week, smiled politely and said that she was not in Hartwell to find a husband but to teach school, which was entirely true and remained true for a considerable time afterward, until it became somewhat less comprehensively true than it had been. She met the school board the next morning, which consisted of Mayor Harold Bright, who was a decent man and a practical one, Reverend Thomas Cow, who was a decent man and a slightly less practical one, and Hector Diaz, whose barn roof had been temporarily patched and who showed up to the meeting smelling pleasantly of sawdust and coffee. They asked Rosa her qualifications. She provided them. They asked about her teaching philosophy. She described it honestly, including the part about teaching all children regardless of background. And Hector Diaz, who had 3 children of mixed heritage who were currently receiving their education entirely in English and not well, looked at Mayor Bright with an expression that constituted a vote, and Rosa Ramsey was hired before she'd finished her second cup of coffee. The schoolhouse was a single room attached to the back of the church, with 8 windows and 23 desks of varying sizes, and a chalkboard that needed replacing, and a wood stove that needed cleaning, and a shelf of books that needed culling and augmenting. Rosa spent her first week in Hartwell preparing the room, and she was content in the way that people are content when they are doing work that is clearly and immediately useful. The children arrived on Monday morning, 21 of them ranging in age from 6 to 14, and they were exactly what children everywhere are, curious and cautious and testing, watching to see what kind of person had come to be in charge of their days. Rosa, who had been tested by children in Missouri and children in Virginia and children in Kansas, was not rattled. She told them her name and asked theirs, and by noon she knew all 21 of them well enough to know which ones would be trouble, and which ones would be the kind of easy good-heartedness that made teaching worth the difficulty. Hartwell absorbed Rosa Ramsey the way good soil absorbs rain. Within 3 weeks she knew most of the families by name. Within 6 weeks, she was helping Mabel organize the spring social. She ate dinner regularly at the Diaz house, where Hector's wife Consuela made food that reminded Rosa inexplicably of comfort, though she'd grown up in Virginia and had never been to Mexico. She attended church on Sundays and found Reverend Cal a better preacher than she'd expected from the school board meeting. She rode, moderately well, a bay mare named Patches that she rented from the livery. She was, in every observable sense, exactly where she was supposed to be. It was in mid-May that the mountain made its first opinion known. She had ridden Patches up the main trail on a Sunday afternoon, not far, just a mile or 2 into the foothills, because the day was the kind of extraordinary that Colorado Territory specializes in during May sky, so blue it seemed artificial, air carrying both the cold of altitude and the warmth of late afternoon in a combination that felt almost medicinal. She had dismounted to look at a stand of aspen just coming into leaf, silver green and trembling, and Patches had taken exception to something in the brush, probably a rabbit, though it could have been anything, and had shied hard, and the lead rope had come out of Rosa's hand, and Patches was gone down the trail at a speed that suggested a different engagement, and Rosa was standing alone in the foothills with nothing but her good boots and a Sunday dress that was not designed for hiking. She was not panicked. She was annoyed, which was different. She assessed the situation with the practical clarity that had carried her through considerably worse circumstances. She was perhaps a mile and a half from town, the trail was clear, her boots were good, and it was still 3 hours to sunset. She would walk back. It would be inconvenient. Patches would either return to the livery on her own, which horses generally did because they were sensible about food and shelter, or someone would find her on the trail and bring her back. Rosa had been walking back for approximately 20 minutes when she heard hoofbeats coming down the mountain from above her on the trail, not Patches. A different horse, heavier, moving with deliberate purpose rather than panic speed. The man who came around the bend in the trail was on a large gray horse, and he was so perfectly suited to the landscape that Rosa's first impression was not of a man at all, but of the mountain having sent a representative. He was broad-shouldered and dark-bearded, dressed in buckskin and flannel, a rifle in the saddle's scabbard, and a look of unhurried alertness that reminded her of a hawk, not threatening, exactly, just comprehensively present. The way wild things are present in a way that people in cities never quite manage. He pulled up the gray horse when he saw her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and Rosa had the peculiar experience of being assessed by a person who was genuinely good at it. "Your horse came past me about a quarter-mile up," he said. His voice was low and even, not unfriendly, simply stating facts. "Bay mare with a loose lead rope. She was headed for the livery at a considerable speed." "That sounds like Patches," Rosa said. "She has a low tolerance for uncertainty." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, more like the consideration of one. "You all right?" "I'm walking," Rosa said. "I'm fine, I've walked farther." She paused because he was still looking at her with that same direct attentiveness, and she was a direct person herself, and so found it unusual to be on the receiving end of it without it feeling like an intrusion. It did not feel like an intrusion. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Rosa Ramsey. I teach school in Hartwell." "Joseph Crawford," he said. She recognized the name immediately from Mabel's thorough catalog of the town and its surrounding characters. The mountain man, once a year in October, self-sufficient, not unattractive, which Rosa thought now had been an understatement of a fairly significant order. "You live up the mountain," she said. "I do," he said. "I came down for a saw blade. Elmore should have had one by now, but the supply wagon was late." He said this as though explaining his presence was necessary, as though the mountain had required him to account for himself, which perhaps it did. He paused for a moment, looking down at her from the gray horse. "I can ride you back to town." Rosa considered the distance and her boots and the afternoon. "That would be kind," she said. He dismounted with the fluid efficiency of a man who had been getting on and off horses in difficult terrain for years without making any sort of ceremony of it, and he helped her up first and then mounted behind her. And the gray horse, whose name was Pike, moved back down the trail with the steady patience of an animal that had hauled more difficult things than two people. They rode in silence for a few minutes, which Rosa did not find uncomfortable. She had always thought that a person who could sit in silence without making it awkward was someone worth knowing. The foothills moved past them, the aspen trembling in the late afternoon air, the shadows lengthening blue and purple across the trail. "How long have you been in Hartwell?" he asked eventually. 5 weeks, she said. "I came from Kansas." "You're the teacher," he said. Hector Diaz's children mentioned a new teacher. Rosa turned enough to look at him, which was an awkward geometry on horseback, and she corrected it. "You know the Diaz family." "Hector helped me drag timber up the mountain 3 summers ago," Joseph said. "Good man. His children are smart." "They are," Rosa agreed. "Lucia has a particular gift for mathematics. I've been trying to get her additional problems because she works through the regular lessons too fast." She paused. "How do you know what the Diaz children said? You come down once a year." "I came down this April for the saw blade," he said. "You came down twice this year," Rosa said, and heard something in her own voice that she could not quite identify, a kind of interest that was slightly more than informational. "The saw blade was necessary," Joseph Crawford said, and the simplicity of it, the absolute lack of elaboration or explanation, made Rosa want to laugh. And she did laugh, just briefly, and she felt him shift behind her on the horse with the small adjustment of a man who is surprised but not displeased. He left her at the livery, where Patches was indeed already installed in her stall and looking entirely unbothered by the afternoon's events. He touched the brim of his hat, which was less a formality than a punctuation mark, and rode back up the mountain road without looking back, and Rosa watched him go with an expression that, had Mabel Hutchins been there to see it, would have been enormously satisfying to that particular woman. Mabel was not there. But Gerald Foote was picking up his horse from the stable, and he saw Rosa watching the road with that expression. And Gerald Foote was not a complicated man, but he was an observant one in his limited way, and he mentioned it that evening at the saloon. And by morning half of Hartwell had been informed that their schoolteacher had been seen watching Joseph Crawford ride away with an look on her face that constituted, depending on which interpretation you favored, either a great deal of interest or a great deal of something that wanted to become interest and was working on it. Rosa taught her 21 children through May and into June, and the school year ended at the beginning of July as was customary, and she spent the summer teaching the children who wanted extra learning, which was a smaller group but no less interesting. She helped Consuela Diaz put up preserves and mend quilts, and she learned enough Spanish over those summer weeks to hold a conversation, slowly and with considerable assistance. And Consuela's delight at this effort was one of the finer things about that summer. She rode patches up the foothills on Sunday afternoons, but she did not leave the well-marked lower trails, and Patches did not shy again, and she did not encounter Joseph Crawford. This was, rationally, not surprising, because he lived 11 miles up the mountain and came to town once a year and had already been twice, and there was no particular reason for a third descent. She thought about him more than made strict sense. She thought about the way he had spoken about Hector Diaz, good man, said plainly, without performance. About the way he had ridden with her without making anything of it, without any of the slightly inflated courtesy that she sometimes encountered from men who were doing a woman a simple kindness and wanted credit for the scale of their sacrifice. He had simply helped, practically and directly, and then gone back to his mountain. She thought about his hands, which she had seen briefly when he helped her up, large and careful. She thought about his voice. She thought about what kind of life a person built 11 miles up a mountain, alone, through 7 Colorado winters, and what it said about a man, not necessarily something damaged or broken, the way Mabel had suggested, but possibly something deliberate, something that knew itself very well and had chosen accordingly. These were not the thoughts of a woman who was merely grateful for a ride home. She acknowledged this to herself in early August, sitting on the porch of the Ridgeline Inn in the evening warmth while the mountains went pink and then gold, and then the deep blue-gray of summer twilight, and she acknowledged it the way she acknowledged most things, directly, clearly, and without particular drama. She was interested in Joseph Crawford. She was interested in him in the specific and troubling way that meant it was not going to be easily set aside by the usual rational reassurances. The question was what, if anything, to do about that, given that the man lived 11 miles up a mountain and came to town once a year. She had no particular answer to this question. She decided to let it rest and see what happened. What happened was August turning to September turning to October, and the school year beginning again with 23 children this time. 2 new families had arrived in the summer, a German couple named Hoffman with twin boys aged 8, and a widow named Mary Strand with a daughter named Pearl who was 9 and extraordinarily shy. Rosa was occupied and happy in the way that meaningful work makes a person occupied and happy, and she did not think about Joseph Crawford every day, only most days. The first week of October brought the first real frost and the first whispers in town about the coming winter, and on the morning of October 6th, a Monday, while Rosa was at the chalkboard writing the multiplication tables for the older students, Pete Rucker said from outside the open schoolhouse window, to no one in particular and everyone in general, "Crawford's coming down." There was a small rustle among the students that Rosa had learned to identify as the town's collective information network in miniature children carried news with the speed and enthusiasm of telegraph wires. And she did not turn from the chalkboard, but she was aware of a sensation in her chest that was not entirely attributable to the morning coffee. She heard later that Joseph Crawford had appeared on the main street at 9:30, conducted his usual business at Elmore's with his usual unhurried efficiency, collected his winter supplies, and had a single drink at the saloon. She heard this from Mabel, who provided it as casual information, and then watched Rosa's face with the studied neutrality of a woman who is being anything but neutral. "He asked about the school," Mabel added. Rosa looked up from the lesson she was preparing. "What do you mean he asked about the school?" "He asked Hank Elmore whether the new teacher was working out," Mabel said. "Whether the children were learning. Hank said yes from what he'd heard." She paused. Hank said that Joseph seemed satisfied with the answer. Rosa considered this information. "He asked about the school," she said again, more to herself than to Mabel. "He did," Mabel said, "and then he went back up the mountain." She paused again, longer this time. "You know, I've been running this inn for 20 years, and I have never once known Joseph Crawford to ask about anything in town that didn't directly concern the acquisition of winter supplies." Rosa put her pen down and looked out the window at the October Street and the mountain road beyond it. "He asked about the school," she said, for the third time, and this time there was something like wonder in her voice that she did not bother to conceal because Mabel Hutchins had earned it. The mountain was wearing its October colors, red and gold and bronze above the dark green of the pines, and the sky above it was the cold, clean blue of high altitude in autumn, and Rosa looked at it for a long time before she picked up her pen and went back to her lesson plans. October turned to November, and November brought snow to the mountain tops, and the children at school began wearing their winter coats, and Rosa learned that Colorado winter at this altitude was a different thing from anything she had previously experienced. The cold was genuine, the kind of cold that has opinions, and the stove in the schoolhouse had to be fed regularly and carefully, and she was grateful for it. She was equally grateful for the delivery of a small package to the schoolhouse, which arrived in mid-November via Hank Elmore, who said only that it had been left at the store with instructions to pass it along to the teacher. Inside was a piece of good quality tanned leather, cut and shaped into a book cover with a simple design pressed into it, a mountain with a single pine tree, and above it, small and precise, an open book. There was no note. Rosa turned the leather book cover over in her hands for a considerable time. Then she went to Elmore's general store and stood in front of Hank Elmore and said, "Who left this?" Hank Elmore had the expression of a man who has been specifically instructed to say nothing, and is now weighing that instruction against the reality of Rosa Ramsey looking at him directly. "The instruction lost. Crawford dropped it by when he came in October," he said. "Said to wait a month before passing it along. Didn't say why." Rosa went home and looked at the mountain cover, and the pressed design of the mountain, and the pine tree, and the small open book. And she thought about a man 11 miles up that mountain making something with his hands in the autumn evenings, and then taking it down to the store, and asking for a month's delay before delivery, as though he was uncertain, and the delay gave him something time to reconsider, perhaps, or simply time to be somewhere else when it arrived so that no answer was immediately required. She sat down at the small desk in her room at the Ridgeline Inn, and she wrote him a letter. She wrote it carefully, 3 drafts, the first 2 formal and the second 2 revealing, and the third finding the right balance between direct and honest without being alarming. She thanked him for the book cover, which she said was the most thoughtful gift she had received in a long time, and she described what was happening in the schoolhouse, Lucia Diaz's progress in mathematics, the twin Hoffman boys who were competitive in everything and learning English at the speed of small motivated tornadoes, Pearl Strand coming out of her shyness by degrees, the way the schoolhouse smelled of pine wood and chalk dust on cold mornings. She asked him what November was like on the mountain. She gave it to Gerald Foote at the post office, who said he'd find a way to get it up to Crawford's place via the occasional trapper or supply runner who went that direction. She did not expect an answer quickly. She did not expect an answer at all, necessarily, since a man who lived 11 miles up a mountain in a Colorado winter was not primarily organized around correspondence. An answer arrived in December, delivered by a Ute trapper named Esteban who came through Hartwell every few weeks and who handed it to Gerald Foote with the gravity of a man entrusted with something of significance. It was not a long letter. It was written in a hand that was careful and slightly unused looking, as though the writer did not do this often and was attending to it with deliberate effort. He said the book cover was something he had made last spring, when he'd heard there was a new teacher in Hartwell, and he'd meant it as a welcome but hadn't known how to give it without it seeming strange. He said November on the mountain was very quiet and very cold, and the snow on the peaks was the kind of white that had no equivalent color in any other context, like the color had been invented specifically for that altitude and that season. He said he had been thinking about what she'd written about Lucia Diaz and mathematics, and that Three Bears, the Ute trapper who had taught him the mountains, had told him once that the people who were best at finding their way were the ones who understood how numbers describe the land, and he thought that was probably true about other things as well. He did not say anything about the 2 trips down the mountain in 1 year. He did not say anything about asking after the school. But the letter was 3 pages long, which from a man like Joseph Crawford, Rosa suspected, was approximately equivalent to a declaration. She wrote back. They wrote to each other through December and into January, and the letters were slow because of the weather and the limited options for getting them up and down the mountain, but they were regular. Rosa found herself composing them in her head while she was teaching, noting things to tell him. The story about the Hoffman twins' spectacular disagreement over whose drawing of a horse was more accurate, and the subsequent classroom debate that had somehow turned into an impromptu lesson in perspective and proportion. The first truly heavy snowfall in Hartwell, and how it changed the sound of everything, muffled and soft, and how she had stood outside the inn at midnight watching it fall in the lamplight, and thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He wrote back about the mountains under deep snow, about the way the animals moved differently in winter, about the quality of silence at high altitude in January that was so complete it had a texture, almost solid. He also wrote in his careful, unpracticed hand that he was sorry she was alone there, which was not quite what she had said. She had said she sometimes felt the weight of the distance from family and friends she'd left behind, but which was perhaps more accurate. He wrote that he understood something about that. He wrote that he thought, from what she described, that she had made something real in Hartwell, the kind of thing that was worth being alone for some times. Rosa read that particular section 3 times and then folded the letter and held it against her chest with both hands like a woman pressing something to herself to make sure it was real. She sent him a long reply. She told him about Virginia, about her parents, about Milford and the school board and the children she had been forced to leave. She told him that she had been moving towards something for 7 years without knowing precisely what it was, and that she had the peculiar feeling, in Hartwell, of having arrived not at an ending but at a beginning, which was different and better. She asked him directly, because she was a direct person, and at 31 he was a grown man who could be spoken to directly. Had he ever considered coming down from the mountain permanently? The answer to that letter took 3 weeks, partly because of the weather and partly, she suspected, because of the question. When it arrived, it was 5 pages, the longest he had written, and it was honest in a way that cost something. He wrote that he had considered it, yes, that he had gone up the mountain in the first place because he needed to understand something about himself that the regular world kept interrupting the understanding of, and that he had come to understand it mostly over 7 years of snow and silence and work. He wrote that he had been, in those 7 years, genuinely content, and that he had not questioned the contentment because it seemed like the kind of gift that was impolite to interrogate. He wrote that something had shifted in May, on the trail, which he'd spent months trying to name, and that the closest he could get to a name for it was that he had been content, and then he had met her, and now he was content in a different and slightly less stable way that included the persistent awareness of what 11 miles was, and whether a person could or should try to make them shorter. Rosa put the letter down and picked it up and put it down again. She was 31 years old herself and had been too busy staying alive and moving west and doing important work to have spent much time on sentimentality. But she was not without a heart, and that heart was, at this particular moment, making itself known in a way that was impossible to ignore. She wrote back, 11 miles is not so very far for a man who's crossed a continent. The winter did what Colorado winters do, which was to be long and serious and beautiful, and by February the mountain passes were genuinely difficult, and letters stopped coming with any regularity. Rosa taught her children and helped Consuela Diaz with the Diaz household's winter projects and read in the evenings by the stove in her room, and she thought about spring with a particularity she had not previously applied to seasons. March came in with a dramatic snowstorm that kept everyone inside for 3 days, and came out with the kind of crisp, clear air that feels like the world has been laundered. And the first mud appeared on the main street, and the first signs of green on the hillsides. And Rosa rode patches up the lower trail on the first suitable Sunday, and looked up at where the mountain went white against the sky, and thought about a man in a cabin up there thinking about 11 miles. The letter she received at the end of March was brief. It said, "I'm coming down in April, not for a saw blade." Rosa read it sitting at the breakfast table in the inn, and Mabel Hutchins, who had been pretending to arrange flowers at the sideboard, turned at the silence and looked at Rosa's face and said, simply and with enormous satisfaction, "Well, he's coming down in April," Rosa said. "I'll make the spare room up properly," Mabel said. He arrived on the 15th of April, which was a Wednesday, and the town of Hartwell watched the arrival of Joseph Crawford's gray horse on the main street with the collective attention of a community that understood, even before anyone had been told anything, that this was not an October visit. Joseph Crawford in April had the look of a man who had made a decision and was committed to it, which was a particular look that people who had made their own decisions recognized immediately. He came to the schoolhouse. Rosa was in the middle of a reading lesson when he appeared in the doorway. She had left the door open because the April air was that rare sweet temperature that deserved to be let inside, and 23 children turned to look at the large man in the doorway with the dark beard and the mountain about him, and then turned to look at their teacher. And what they saw on their teacher's face was something that a 6-year-old could not have named but a 14-year-old could, and Lucia Diaz, who was 13 and exceptionally observant, looked from Joseph Crawford to Miss Ramsey and back, and smiled the quiet private smile of a person who has just confirmed something they already suspected. "Class," Rosa said, with a steadiness she was proud of, "please continue reading chapter 6 silently. I need a moment." She walked to the door, and Joseph Crawford stepped back to let her out, and they stood in the April sunshine outside the schoolhouse. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her on the trail a year ago, that direct, unhurried attention that saw everything it was looking at. He looked slightly less certain than he had on the trail, which was interesting, because on the trail he had been very certain indeed. "You said not for a saw blade," Rosa said. "Not for a saw blade," he confirmed. "Then what for?" He was quiet for a moment. In the schoolhouse behind them, the rustling sound of 23 children pretending to read silently was audible. He took his hat off, which Rosa recognized as the equivalent, for Joseph Crawford, of an elaborate formal gesture. "I would like to call on you," he said, "if that's acceptable." Rosa looked at him for a moment. This man who had come down from the mountain twice in 1 year and then written letters through the winter and then come down again in April with his hat in his hands. And she thought about the mountain cover with the pressed pine tree and the open book, and the letter about the color of snow at altitude, and "I'm coming down in April." Not for a saw blade. That's acceptable, she said. He stayed in Hartwell for a week. It was a week of considerable social complexity, because Hartwell was a town that had strong opinions about propriety and an equally strong appetite for romantic narrative. And the combination of these two things meant that Joseph Crawford calling on Rosa Ramsey was simultaneously the most discussed event since the Henderson's barn dance of 1876, and the most carefully managed social situation in recent memory. Mabel Hutchins organized it all with the precision of a military campaign, ensuring that every occasion on which they were together had the appropriate degree of chaperonage, while arranging a schedule that provided the maximum possible opportunity for actual conversation. They walked in the evenings along the river trail, with Mabel trailing at a distance that she considered respectful and Rosa considered theatrical. They sat on the inn porch in the late afternoons, and Joseph drank coffee with the careful appreciation of a man who had been making his own coffee alone for 7 years and understood the difference. They attended Sunday church together, which caused Reverend Cal to preach a sermon on the subject of providence that everyone in the congregation understood to be relevant to the present circumstances, and which the Reverend delivered with an expression of beatific satisfaction. Rosa showed him the school when it was empty, in the late afternoon with the April light coming through the 8 windows. She showed him Lucia's mathematics work, which was spread across a desk, pages of calculations that went well beyond what the curriculum required. Joseph looked at it carefully, the same attention he gave everything, and said, "She should have harder problems." "I've been corresponding with a mathematics professor at the University of Colorado," Rosa said. "He sent a packet of advanced geometry problems last month. She's working through them." Joseph looked at her. "You wrote to a university professor for one student." "She's exceptional," Rosa said simply. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You're something else, Rosa Ramsey." And the way he said it, not like a compliment exactly, more like an observation about the nature of reality, made her feel seen in a way that was surprisingly difficult to stand still under. She stood still under it anyway. She was good at that. On the 4th evening, walking along the river trail while the sun went down in spectacular Colorado fashion, painting everything amber and rose, Joseph Crawford said, "I've been thinking about the 11 miles." "I've been thinking about them too," Rosa said. "The cabin is good," he said. "It's a good cabin, it's warm and it's solid and it's in a good place." He paused. "But it was built for one person." Rosa looked at the river, which was running high with snowmelt, silver and cold and moving with purpose. "You're telling me something," she said. "I'm trying to," he said. I'm better at building things than saying them." "You said them fairly well in your letters," she pointed out. "Letters are easier," he said. "You can cross things out." He stopped walking and turned to face her, and the last of the amber light was on him, and he was holding his hat in his hands again, which she had begun to understand was his version of being very serious. "I want to ask you something. I want to be clear that I'm not asking you to give anything up. Not the school, not this town, not any of it. I think what you're doing here it matters. I think you matter here. I don't want to take you away from that." Rosa had stopped walking when he stopped walking, and she was looking at him with the same direct attention he used on everything, because this seemed to deserve it. "Then what are you asking?" "Whether you'd consider," he said, and then stopped and began again. "Whether you would consider the possibility of I'm asking if you would be willing to let me court you properly." He said it in a rush that was entirely unlike the slow, deliberate way he said everything else, as though this particular set of words had been dammed up for some time and the dam had finally let go. "Not just calling. Not letters. I mean properly, with the intention of something permanent, if you're willing. If you want that." Rosa was quiet for a moment, which was not the same as being uncertain. She was certain. She had been certain since March. She had been perhaps somewhat certain since May, though she had not admitted that to herself until considerably later. "I want that," she said. He looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not triumph, not relief, though there was some of both. Mostly it was the look of a man who had not known he was cold until someone lit a fire. He reached out and took her hand carefully, the way he did everything carefully, and they stood by the river in the amber light and the sound of the snowmelt water and the distant mountains. "I'll need to come down more than once a year," he said. Rosa laughed, full and genuine, the way she laughed when something struck her as both funny and true. "I would say so," she agreed. He came down every 2 weeks through April and May, riding Pike down the mountain trail on Friday evenings and riding back up on Sunday afternoons. And the town of Hartwell observed this schedule with the warm approval of a community that liked things to work out, which they did not always, and appreciated it when they did. The Friday evening arrivals became part of the rhythm of Rosa's weeks in the way that good things become, not something you wait for anxiously, but something you find yourself moving toward with the pleasant certainty of arrival. They talked endlessly. This surprised Rosa slightly, not because she was not a talker. She was a teacher, talking was the medium of her work, but because she had expected Joseph Crawford, the man of silences and mountains, to be someone she talked at rather than with. What she found was something different. A man who listened with the same complete attention he gave to everything, who thought before he spoke and said things when he spoke them that were worth the wait, who had accumulated 7 years of a particular kind of solitary thinking, and was now directing it at her in ways that illuminated things she thought she already knew. He told her about 3 bears who had died 3 years ago of a fever that Doc Pierce, had he been present, might have managed differently. He said this without bitterness, but with the particular flat tone of someone who has made their peace with an injustice by acknowledging it clearly. He told her that 3 bears had been a better man than most of the men he'd met in organized civilization, and that the way civilization treated the Ute people was a shame that the territory would carry for a long time, and he said it the way he said things about Hector Diaz's children plainly, as a fact about the world that you either saw or you didn't. Rosa told him about Milford and the school board, and he listened without interruption, and at the end he said, "Good thing you left," not meaning that she had been wrong or weak, but meaning that Hartwell was better for having her. She thought about that distinction for days. In June, he brought her up the mountain. He came down on a Friday with Pike and a second horse, a steady roan mare named Copper who belonged to a rancher named Davis who owed Joseph a favor, and on Saturday morning Rosa borrowed riding clothes from Consuela Diaz who was close to her size, and they rode up the mountain in the early light. It took 3 hours, and it was unlike any ride Rosa had ever taken. The trail went from the valley's flat certainty up through forest that changed character as the altitude increased, from ponderosa pines to spruce and fir, the air getting thinner and more crystalline with each switchback, the sounds of the town dropping away below them, until the only sounds were wind and horses, and their own voices when they spoke, which they did intermittently and comfortably. The cabin was on a shelf of land that opened suddenly from the trees, and Rosa pulled Copper to a stop and looked at it. It was exactly right. She did not know why she had expected anything else. Everything about Joseph Crawford was exactly right in its own particular way, but it struck her anyway. The cabin was solid and low, built of dark logs fitted together with an attention to craft that showed in the way the walls sat, settled and permanent, like the cabin had grown there rather than been built. There was a porch facing south and west toward the valley, looking down over 11 miles of mountain and forest to where Hartwell sat like a small, precise arrangement of buildings in the distance. There was a garden plot, fenced against deer, with last year's structure still visible. There was a shed for Pike and tools. There was a stack of firewood that reached the eaves and stretched 20 feet along the north wall. "You built all of this," Rosa said. "Over several years," he said. "It started smaller." She walked toward the porch, looking at the view. Standing there, looking down at Hartwell in the morning light, she understood something she hadn't before, why he had stayed, why the mountain had been worth 7 years of solitude. You could see everything from here. Not just the town, the whole valley, the whole sweep of the San Juans in every direction, the world organized by altitude into something comprehensible. "It's extraordinary," she said. He was standing beside her, looking not at the view but at her looking at the view. "Yes," he said, and she knew he did not mean the landscape. She went inside. The interior was clean and ordered with the spare efficiency of someone who has lived alone long enough to have solved the problem of living without waste. There was a main room with a stone fireplace that was very large and very well made, a table, 2 chairs, shelves of books and tools, and supplies arranged with the logic of someone who needed to find things in the dark. There was a loft for sleeping, accessed by a ladder of notched logs. There were windows on 3 sides, and the light that came in through them was the clear high-altitude light that made everything look slightly more real than usual. There were the letters, she noticed, stacked carefully on the shelf near the fireplace. Her letters, every one of them kept in a stack with a strip of leather around them. She looked at them and then looked at him, and he met her eyes with the straightforward acknowledgement of a man who does not pretend about things. "Every letter," she said. "Every letter," he confirmed. She stayed for the day and rode back down in the late afternoon, with the sun behind the mountains and the valley filling with the long blue shadows of Colorado evening. And she rode back with the particular feeling of a woman who has understood something that was already true and is now certain of it in her bones. He proposed in July. He did it on the inn porch in the evening, which was public enough that Mabel Hutchins was able to witness it from inside the parlor window while appearing to rearrange the curtains, and it was Joseph Crawford's version of a proposal, which was to say it was direct and plain and devoid of performative speeches and all the more moving for it. He said, "I want to marry you, Rosa. I want us to figure out the rest of it, the house, the town, the mountain, all of it together, but I know what I want it to be. I want it to be you." He reached into his coat and produced a ring that he had made, or rather he had had the gold shaped in Denver and he had set the stone himself, a small deep green tourmaline, which was a Colorado stone, found in the mountains and was the color of the pines in summer. Rosa looked at the ring and then at the man and she said, "Yes, Joseph Crawford, yes." He put the ring on her finger with the careful, deliberate attention of a man for whom things done with the hands were done right, and she looked at it in the evening light and thought it was the most beautiful piece of jewelry she had ever owned, not because of its cost, but because she knew exactly how it had been made and by whom and what it meant. Mabel Hutchins made a sound from inside the parlor window that she subsequently denied making, and the curtains moved. They were married in October. It seemed fitting to marry in October, which had been his month, the month of the one annual descent, the month that the town associated with Joseph Crawford. They married in the church on a Saturday with the whole of Hartwell present, which was to say approximately 140 people, most of whom had been living in Hartwell for fewer than 5 years, and had nonetheless adopted strong personal stakes in the outcome. Reverend Cal officiated with visible joy and a sermon that referenced Providence again, which at this point felt like his particular contribution to the whole affair. Rosa wore a dress that Consuela Diaz and Mabel Hutchins had conspired to produce over the preceding 2 months, a deep cream wool with simple trimming, and she carried a small bunch of late-blooming wild asters that Joseph had brought down from the mountain that morning, still with the mountain cold on them. Joseph wore his best flannel and a coat that Hank Elmore had sourced from Denver, and which had been altered twice to accommodate shoulders that were not designed for standard Denver tailoring. He took her hand at the altar and looked at her with those storm-cloud eyes, and said his vows in his low, even voice, with the attention of a man making a commitment he had thought about very carefully, and intended to keep absolutely. She said hers back with the direct clarity of a woman who knew her own mind. Lucia Diaz was there, and she looked at Miss Ramsey becoming Mrs. Crawford with an expression that was simultaneously happy and thoughtful, in the way of a girl who is already working out what things like this mean about the larger world and its possibilities. They spent the wedding night at the inn. Mabel had prepared the best room with the intensity of a woman fulfilling a long-held vision, and rode up to the mountain cabin the next day, a Sunday, in the October light, with the aspens in full color, gold and red and bronze against the dark pines, the most extravagant natural decoration a wedding could have asked for. Rosa had arranged with the school board to continue teaching through the school year, riding down the mountain on Monday mornings and back up on Friday evenings, which Mayor Bright had accepted with the pragmatism of a man who knew that losing Rosa Ramsey from the Hartwell schoolhouse would be a significant civic catastrophe. Joseph had agreed to this without any reservation, because he was not a man who had decided to marry a schoolteacher with the intention of interrupting the school teaching, and also because he understood, from the letters and from the months of conversation on the river trail, that what Rosa did in that schoolhouse was not incidental to who she was but central to it. He rode down with her on Monday mornings, and they parted at the edge of town with a kiss that Pete Rucker witnessed from his chair, with the settled satisfaction of a man watching something be as it ought to be. Joseph went back up the mountain and came back down on Friday, and the town became accustomed to seeing him twice a week, which was a remarkable expansion of the previous once-a-year schedule, and one that Hartwell accepted enthusiastically, because Joseph Crawford, as it turned out, was useful to have around. He had skills the town needed. He could assess structural problems in buildings. He could treat injuries in the field. He knew the mountain weather patterns better than anyone, and he was willing to share all of this with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did. He also built a second room onto the cabin over that first winter, working on the weekends when Rosa was home and on the days between, because the cabin that had been right for one person needed to grow for two, and growing things was something he understood. Rosa spent her weeks in Hartwell and her weekends on the mountain, and the 11 miles became something different from what they had been, not a distance to be overcome, but a commute to be made, a regular path between two versions of her life that were not competing but complementary. The schoolhouse from Monday through Friday, and then the mountain and Joseph and the extraordinary silence of high altitude on Friday evenings, and the view of the valley from the porch, and the stone fireplace, and the man who read beside her in the evenings and was very good at being in the same room without requiring anything of the silence. By February she knew she was pregnant. She told him on a Friday evening, sitting by the fireplace with the snow on the peaks outside the window turning blue in the evening light, and he was very still for a moment in the way he was still when he was taking something seriously. And then he said, "Rosa," in a voice that contained everything he felt about it without being able to expand further into language. And he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they sat like that for a long time while the fire spoke in its quiet language, and the mountain held them. The baby was born in September of 1880, delivered by Doc Pierce with Consuela Diaz and Mabel Hutchins both present, because no force on earth was going to separate either of those women from this particular birth. It was a boy, born early in the morning with the light coming in the windows of the cabin. They had come down to Hartwell for the last month of the pregnancy, staying at the inn, because Doc Pierce and good sense had agreed on it, and he arrived into the world with a robust opinion about the situation, which he expressed loudly and at length. Joseph Crawford held his son with the careful, deliberate attention of a man doing something with his hands that matters more than anything else he has ever done, and his face did something that Rosa had never seen it do before, a kind of opening, like a window being thrown wide on a clear day. They named him William Henry Crawford, for no particular person, but for the sound of it and the weight of it and the way it seemed right. William was solid and earnest from the beginning, a baby who took the world seriously in the way of people who will later be described as having a calm temperament, which concealed from casual observers the fact that he was actually taking detailed notes on everything and had opinions, he simply hadn't yet developed the language to express. He had Joseph's gray eyes and Rosa's directness, and when he looked at you, even as an infant, you had the sense of being genuinely regarded. Rosa went back to teaching when William was 2 months old, with Mabel Hutchins established as the primary daily caregiver in a role she had essentially claimed before William was born, and which she performed with the fierce competence of a woman doing the thing she was best at. Joseph came down from the mountain every day in those first months, which was a complete revolution of his previous schedule, and one which he performed without complaint, and with the addition of considerable practical domestic capability. Joseph Crawford on a domestic morning was as efficient as Joseph Crawford on a trapping expedition, which was very efficient indeed. The school year of 1880 to 1881 was the best yet, Rosa thought. Lucia Diaz, now 14, was working through the university-level mathematics problems with a speed that made the mathematics professor in Denver, who had by now become a regular correspondent, write that he had never in his career encountered a student of her quality, and that arrangements ought to be made for her further education in ways that the Hartwell schoolhouse could not provide. Rosa had already been thinking about this problem, and had been corresponding with the University of Colorado about scholarship possibilities. It was the kind of work that extended beyond the schoolroom and into the larger world, and it was exactly the kind of work that had made Milford's school board nervous and that Hartwell's school board, to their very considerable credit, supported without reservation. Hector Diaz, when Rosa explained the situation to him and Consuela at their kitchen table, was very quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My daughter at the university," in a voice that was so full of something hope, disbelief, the complex emotion of a man whose own opportunities had been limited by the prejudices of a world that had not valued him appropriately, that Rosa had to look at the table for a moment. "She's the best mathematics student I have ever taught," Rosa said, "possibly the best I've ever encountered. She deserves every opportunity." "We have no money for university," Consuela said. "There's a scholarship," Rosa said. "I've written to the university. Professor Hartley has written on her behalf. We're working on it." It took 8 months and a great deal of letter writing, and in the spring of 1882, Lucia Diaz was offered a full scholarship to study mathematics at the University of Colorado. She was 15, the youngest student they had ever accepted. She cried, which was the only time Rosa had ever seen Lucia cry, and Consuela cried, and Hector did not cry but stood in the doorway of his house looking at the letter with an expression that was perhaps the most complex emotion Rosa had witnessed in Colorado territory. Joseph, when she told him, said, "Good," in the way he said things when he meant them very much. The years in Hartwell continued to build themselves into a life that felt, to Rosa, like something she had been walking toward without knowing the direction until she arrived. She taught school. Joseph ranged between the mountain and the town with a freedom that seemed to suit both his nature and the life they had made, sometimes spending weeks on the mountain during trapping season, sometimes in town for days at a stretch when something required it, always knowing where home was and moving toward it with the steady, purposeful quality of a man who has oriented himself. They had a second child in 1883, a girl they named Clara Frances Crawford, who arrived in early spring and who had Rosa's dark hair and Joseph's gray eyes, and a personality from the earliest age that seemed to be conducting an ongoing investigation into the nature of everything, picking up objects and examining them with the systematic interest of a small scientist. She and William, who was 3 and very serious, observed each other for the first week with the mutual caution of diplomats, and then reached some private accord, and from that point were inseparable in the way of children who have decided each other is necessary. The cabin on the mountain had grown again. Joseph had added a proper second bedroom for the children, and the main room had been extended with a window wall on the south side that let in the winter light and was Rosa's favorite place to read in the afternoons when she was home on weekends. He had also, over the years, built a better trail between the cabin and Hartwell, worked on with help from Davis and Hector Diaz, and once, a crew of young men from town who had spent a Saturday in the foothills for reasons that were described as a work party, but which mostly involved Joseph teaching them things about building that they hadn't known before, and which they would find useful for the rest of their lives. The 11 miles were now 35 minutes by the improved trail on a good horse, which changed their character entirely. Hartwell grew. New families arrived through the early 1880s, drawn by the stories of good land and a functioning town and a school with a genuinely exceptional teacher. And the school grew with them, to 31 students by 1884 and then 39. And Rosa went to the school board and said she needed an assistant teacher, and the school board agreed. And she hired a young woman from Denver named Clara Wells, who had recently completed her teaching certificate, and who took to Hartwell with the enthusiasm of a person who had found their place. Joseph, who had spent years trading his furs at Elmore's, had developed enough of a trading relationship with the Denver fur market that Hank Elmore proposed a partnership. And over several conversations that took most of a winter, they worked out an arrangement, whereby Joseph managed the fur supply side of things and Hank the commercial side, which suited their respective skills precisely. It was not a transformation into a businessman. Joseph Crawford was not and would never be primarily a businessman. But it was a recognition that the skills of the mountain had value in the market, and that value, properly managed, produced the kind of stability that made a life with 2 children and a schoolteacher wife in Colorado territory something that could be built rather than merely survived. In the evenings at the cabin, with William doing his schoolwork at the table, and Clara drawing her systematic investigations of leaves and rocks and insects in the journal Rosa had given her for her 3rd birthday, and the fire going and the mountains dark outside the windows with the stars enormous at altitude, Rosa sometimes paused in whatever she was doing writing lesson plans, reading. Corresponding with Lucia at the university, who wrote monthly letters full of mathematics and the description of a world opening up, and looked at the room and the people in it, and felt the particular satisfaction of a life that had been built rather than happened to. Joseph, who noticed most things, noticed when she did this, and he would look at her from across the room with a question in his expression, and she would shake her head slightly to mean "I'm fine," more than fine, and he would nod with the understanding of a man who has been paid attention to for long enough to know what that particular look means. One evening in the autumn of 1885, with the Aspens doing their annual extravagant performance outside the cabin windows, William, who was 5 and already reading well, looked up from his book and said, "Papa, why do you live on the mountain?" Joseph looked at his son with the full attention he gave to questions that deserved it. "I came up here when I needed to understand something," he said. "What did you need to understand?" "Who I was," Joseph said, "and whether the world I'd come from was the only kind of world there was." William considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old who is conducting very serious business. "Did you find out?" "I did," Joseph said, "and then I found something better than the answer." William looked at Rosa and Rosa looked at Joseph, and Clara, who was 2 and understood more than she could say, looked at all 3 of them with the systematic interest of someone cross-referencing data. "What was better than the answer?" William asked. Joseph reached over and took Rosa's hand, which he did not do performatively ever, but which he did with the ease of long practice and genuine intent. "The right question," he said, "which turned out to be someone asking it with you." William looked at their hands and then at his father's face and said, "Oh," with the tone of someone who has understood something at a level below language. Rosa pressed Joseph's hand once briefly, with the small specific pressure of a woman communicating something that required no translation. He pressed back. The autumn of 1885 brought a dry spell that worried the ranchers and a late frost that damaged some of the gardens, but it also brought the dedication of a new school building in Hartwell, a proper building with 3 rooms and a basement for storage and windows that were the right size for the light, which Rosa had been working toward for 2 years and which Mayor Bright, now in his 3rd term, was pleased to preside over the dedication ceremony of, with an address that gave proper credit to the person most responsible. Rosa stood in the new schoolhouse on the morning of the dedication, in the main room with its 3 walls of windows, and its large chalkboard and its rows of good solid desks made by a carpenter in Pueblo. And she thought about the single room she had walked into in April of 1879, with its inadequate stove and its chalkboard that needed replacing, and the 23 children who had come in that Monday morning to look at the new teacher with their calibrating eyes. Several of those children were now old enough to be in the gathering outside for the dedication. Lucia was at the university. Pearl Strand, the shy girl with the pale hair, was 16 and apprenticed to the local dressmaker, and had turned out to have a talent for design that no one had expected, but that, Rosa thought, she might have predicted if she had looked carefully enough at the drawings Pearl had made in school, always precise, always structured, always paying close attention to how things fit together. Joseph was in the crowd outside, standing with William on his shoulders so the boy could see over the adult heads, and Clara was on Consuela Diaz's hip because Consuela could not be in the same room as Clara without wanting to hold her, and Clara had no objection to Consuela. He caught Rosa's eye through the window and gave her one of his rare complete smiles, the full version that he reserved for things that merited it, and she smiled back with the ease of a woman who has been smiled at that way for 6 years and has not yet found it anything other than extraordinary. Mayor Bright finished his address and cut the ribbon with the ceremonial scissors that had been used for every ribbon cutting in Hartwell since the post office dedication of 1877, and the crowd applauded, and the children ran in first, because that seemed right. That evening back at the cabin, with both children asleep in the room Joseph had built for them, and the fire settled to coals, and the autumn stars enormous through the south window, Rosa and Joseph sat on the porch in the cold, clear air wrapped in blankets, looking at the valley below them where Hartwell's lights were a small, warm arrangement in the dark. "Do you remember what you wrote in that first letter?" Rosa asked. "The one where you described November on the mountain." "Most of it," Joseph said. He was quiet for a moment. "I said the snow at altitude was a color that had no equivalent anywhere else." "You said it was like the color had been invented specifically for that altitude and that season," Rosa said. "I've thought about that so many times, that something could be so particular to a place and a time that it only exists there." He was looking at the valley or at the stars or at something between them. "Things are like that," he said. "The best things, specific to where they happen." Rosa pulled her blanket tighter and leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. He shifted without looking, the automatic accommodation of a person whose body has learned the geography of someone else's, and put his arm around her. "I'm glad I came on the stage to Hartwell," she said. "I'm glad a rabbit spooked your horse," he said. She laughed, the full, clear laugh that he had first heard on Pike's Back coming down the trail 3 years before they were married, the laugh that contained the whole of her. "You came down for a saw blade." "I came down for a saw blade," he agreed, and she could hear the smile in it. The fire inside had settled to a deep red glow visible through the cabin's south window, and the children were asleep, and the mountains were doing the thing they did at night, which was to become more present rather than less, the dark peaks against the star-crowded sky, as though the darkness gave them back their weight and their scale and the full authority of everything they had seen. "Another year coming," Rosa said, looking at the valley. "Yes," Joseph said. "A good one, I think." "I think so, too." They sat like that for a long time, 2 people on a mountain above a small Colorado town, looking at the lights of the place they had both, by different routes and for different reasons, arrived at and decided was home. The aspens had finished their annual drama and were bare now, silver-white in the starlight, and the pines beyond them were dark and constant and permanent. And somewhere below them, the river was running cold and clear and purposeful, and the 11 miles between the mountain and the town were no longer a distance but a measure of something else. The particular geography of a life that had been chosen carefully and built with attention and would continue to grow, the way good things continue to grow. For a long time. In the spring of 1886, William Crawford went to school for the first time in the Hartwell schoolhouse, where his mother was his teacher, which was an arrangement that William, who was by then 5½ and very confident in the structure of his world, thought was entirely sensible and correct. He took his seat in the front row with the settled authority of a boy who has grown up between a mountain and a town, and understands that both have their logic and their requirements, and looked at his mother at the chalkboard, with the same gray, attentive eyes she had looked into on a mountain trail 11 years ago on a May afternoon. And she looked back at her son, and at the room full of children who needed her, and at the windows that showed the mountains beyond the town, and felt the specific full-bodied feeling of a life that is exactly what it should be. Joseph came down from the mountain that Friday evening as he always did, and Mabel Hutchins, who was 62 now and had reduced her active management of the inn but had not reduced anything else about herself, was sitting on the inn porch when he rode past on Pike, and she called out, "Good evening, Joseph Crawford," in the tone of a woman who has been right about something for a very long time and takes appropriate satisfaction in it. Joseph touched the brim of his hat to her. "Evening, Mabel." "How's the mountain? Still there," he said, "and your family?" He looked down the main street to where the schoolhouse window was lit with the late afternoon light, Rosa's shadow visible at the chalkboard, the small shapes of children at their desks. He had the look he always had looking at it, that particular look of a man who came down from a mountain once a year, until something changed, and then found that coming down, over and over, was not a diminishment of the mountain life but an addition to it, one he had not known he needed until he'd met the specific woman who made him understand what the 11 miles were for. "Good," he said. "Everything's good." He rode down to the schoolhouse, and tied Pike to the post outside, and went in through the open door into the warmth and the chalk dust and the pinewood smell, and the sound of his wife's voice explaining something to a roomful of children. And William looked up from his desk at his father, and smiled with the gray-eyed seriousness of a boy who knows exactly where he is and where he belongs. And Rosa turned from the chalkboard and looked at Joseph Crawford standing in the door of her schoolhouse on a Friday evening in the spring of 1886, and she looked at him the way she had looked at the mountain from the porch on the very first evening in Hartwell, all those years ago, with the recognition that something extraordinary was exactly where it was supposed to be and had been all along waiting for the looking. "Class," she said to her 27 students, "we'll continue Monday." She set down her chalk. "Have a good weekend." The children gathered their things with the efficient enthusiasm of children released, and Joseph stepped back from the doorway to let them stream past, and William came last, walking with the small, deliberate steps of a boy who has decided that the world does not require rushing, and took his father's hand, and the three of them walked out into the Colorado spring evening, where Clara was waiting with Consuela on the Diaz porch across the street, and the mountains were pink above the town in the last of the sunlight. And the aspens on the lower slopes were the new green of just opening leaves, that particular color that only exists in that altitude in that season, the color you cannot find anywhere else, specific to where it happens, which is the best kind of thing. They were home for supper, all four of them, and the fire was good, and the mountains held their positions through the night as they had done for longer than the word for it. And in the morning the sun came up over the San Juans and laid itself across the cabin's south window and across Rosa Ramsey Crawford sleeping beside the man she had ridden up from a mountain trail to find, and the world was exactly and completely what it was, which was enough, and more than enough, and everything.